Everybody, I would like to welcome you all to the first Sociology and Anthropology capstone presentation session. Before we start, I just would like to remind you all that there is a sign-up sheet over there, so make sure that you sign up to make sure that your instructors know that you are here. So if you haven't done so, make sure to sign up on the sign-up sheet there. Okay, before we start, I would like to have an announcement. Every year, Department of Sociology and Anthropology gives an award. It's called a Klein Award for a rising senior for sociology and anthropology. And this year, the faculty members at the department selected Hannah Larson. The recipient of the award. So would you like to come up here and we would like to congratulate Hannah for this achievement. This endowed award is given annually to a student who has done good work in the curriculum and whose activities on campus and in the larger community reflect a high degree of concern for human dignity, goodwill, and understanding among people of diverse backgrounds. And I would like to congratulate Hannah for this achievement. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the first of a series of panels from the Sociology and Anthropology Department. Today is our panel called It's All in a Day's Work, Gender and Identity Construction in the Workplace. I'd like to go ahead and remind you all to make sure that your cell phones are also turned off as well, so that there's no interruption. Our first presenter is Danielle Landy, and the topic of her research was Women and Emotional Labor in Customer Service Jobs.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here and supporting us with our capstone presentations. As Christy already said, my name is Danielle Landy, and I'll be presenting on women and emotional labor in customer service jobs. My thesis addresses women's experiences in customer service positions. In my research, I look closely at the customer-worker interactions, the systems that enforce those interactions, and how the worker learns to understand the meaning of emotional labor. So I want to start off by defining emotional labor, since it is the foundation of my thesis. I'm going to use the words of one of my respondents, Maria, who describes the core of what emotional labor is within her own framework. Maria is 22 years old from New York City, and she has worked multiple customer service jobs, including retail and fast food. And she says, service jobs don't afford one the luxury or privilege of expressing emotion, or more importantly, opinions, more so than any other job. Offices and other workspaces tend to have a sense of community, with appropriate venues for expressing your opinions or emotions. In most cases, excessive emotions are not productive in the workplace and are unprofessional, especially if they are negative. But in customer service positions, where your main interaction is with the customer and not colleagues, aka equals, there's more masking of emotions. So I want to ask you all a question. Please raise your hand if you've ever worked in a customer service job. Well, that's a whole lot of you. So out of those that raised your hand, please raise your hand again if something in what Maria said about customer service resonates with you in your own experience. Great. So before I continue, I want to address the fact that all of us have experienced emotional labor in some shape or form. I have chosen to focus on customer service jobs because of the substantial demand for emotional labor that reveals itself in the constant customer interaction, whether that be face-to-face or voice-to-voice, as well as in the job description itself. So I have worked in a few different customer service positions. However, there was one in particular that inspired my thesis topic. I worked at a hardware store for 2 summers in a row as a cashier. And during my interview, the manager asked me, "Why do you want to work here?" Assuming that she wasn't looking for an honest answer, "I need the money," I responded, "I want to work here because as a customer myself, I really appreciate when employees work their hardest to put the customer first and truly want them to have a positive shopping experience. I want to give back and be a part of that experience by being the best employee that I can be to make sure that every customer is satisfied." So obviously, I was called the very next day to see when I could start working. And I soon came to understand my response as putting on a mask, a facade, a performance, and emotional labor. So most of my fellow cashiers would talk openly about their personal conflicts and discomforts while at work. However, the moment a customer walked up to the register, they would immediately start smiling. "Good morning, how are you? Did you find everything you need okay? Yes, it is great weather. Do you have a rewards card? Thank you, have a great day." And it was fascinating for me to observe my coworkers completely changing their emotions and behaviors so quickly, as well as my own, no matter what we had been discussing prior. So I was introduced to the concept of emotional labor near the end of my 2nd summer as a potential topic for my senior thesis. And it has been through that process of collecting meaningful stories that I finally understand the significance of these personal narratives. Through qualitative research, I address how women experience emotional labor in customer service positions and what influences emotional labor for women in these jobs. In my thesis, I address how the structure of workplace spaces, the construction of gender, and how assumed socioeconomic status influence how workers experience emotional labor. I also address how constant customer interaction affects workers. I used qualitative research for my thesis in order to maintain strong relationships with the women that I interviewed. I used snowball sampling in order to reach out to a variety of women from multiple customer service jobs. And I used participant observation based on my own positionality in the service industry. The majority of my respondents, 2/3, identified as white and 1/3 identified as Hispanic. Although there is a lack of diversity in the numbers of respondents that I interviewed, there is a very important connection between gender, race, and ethnicity, and because of this, I have included a section specific to race, gender, and ethnicity in my written thesis. While socioeconomic class is also a very important factor in women's experiences, as a few of my respondents commented on, I intentionally chose not to include workers' socioeconomic class in my thesis, which is something that I will explain later in my presentation. The majority of my respondents were seasonal workers and not full-time. So now that I've given you an idea of how I became involved in my research, I will move into the broader theoretical themes that connect to these experiences. The theory used for my thesis goes hand in hand with my data analysis and is essential to showing the multiple factors that influence emotional labor. In the following slides, I will define each of these separately. However, it is important to note that all of these are connected within women's experiences in customer service. Sociologist Arlie Hochfield first coined the term emotional labor as the commodification of human feelings in the workplace, and a form of emotion regulation that requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others. So, like a physical labor who may become alienated from what they make, an emotional labor, such as a flight attendant, may become separated not only from her own expressions of feeling, for instance, her smile, but also from what she actually feels, so her managed politeness or friendliness. The theory of gendered organizations is essential to my thesis, and so much of my respondents' experiences were based on the gender of their workplace. Joan Acker, feminist sociologist who writes in depth about the theory of gendered organizations, states, "To say that an organization or any other analytic unit is gendered means that advantage and disadvantage, exploitation and control, action and emotion, meaning and identity are patterned through and in terms of a distinction between male and female, masculine and feminine. Gender is not an addition to ongoing processes conceived as gender neutral. Rather, it is an integral part of those processes." So to sum up what Acker says, workplaces are not gender neutral. They are very much so gendered. And in my thesis, I looked closely at how working in a traditionally male-type service job versus female-type service job affected how female employees experience their gender. And it became clear that women who work in predominantly male-type service jobs, hardware stores, sports bars, etc., were much more aware of their gender in the workplace because of the gendered structure of the workplace. As Angela, who works at a hardware store, says, "On a regular basis, I do the same work as male employees, such as lifting bags of mulch. When a customer sees me, they tell me I shouldn't be doing it and a male should. There are expectations that because I'm female, I should not be working on the floor, it should only be standing behind a cash register. I find this highly offensive because I know and have proven that I can do just as much as the males that I work with." So according to the theory of gendered organizations, this division of labor by gender favors men because organizations value men and qualities associated with masculinity more highly than they value women. Multiple respondents shared similar experiences in regards to this gender division of labor. However, respondents that worked in female-type workplaces, like clothing, lingerie, or makeup, reported that their gender did not affect their interactions with customers. Okay, so this is a screenshot from Indiana University Health, where employees are being trained to respond to clients with yes ma'am, no ma'am. And this image exemplifies how workers are expected to speak with customers in these specific ways. And as we can see, workers change the way they speak to show their willingness to serve the customer. For example, instead of saying, "What are you here for?" employees are trained to ask, "How may I help you?" And instead of saying, "Okay, not a problem," or "Bye," employees must say, "It's my pleasure. Is there anything else I can do for you?" This is called social script. It allocates rules for how employees must present themselves as a representative of their workplace. One of my respondents, Jenny, says, "To be a good employee, you always have to put the customer first and be attentive and pleasant no matter what." Another respondent says, "A good customer service employee treats the customer well no matter what, is accommodating, and follows company policy." Both respondents talked about how presenting a positive image of customer service is the most important part of the script. Gender role socialization plays a huge role in this social script. Scripted interactions in the workplace between workers and customers are gendered, because just as women are expected by others to have specific emotion-based traits, workers construct or do gender through their work. One respondent says, "In my opinion, I feel like female employees are expected to be friendlier than male employees." And playing off of that, Catherine says, "Being a woman and working in a highly sexualized world and an environment where alcohol is consumed rapidly, it has been difficult to find the middle ground of stern but friendly." So women are socialized to interact in this gendered way, and the social script that female employees perform reinforces this notion. In our culture, we frequently ask new acquaintances, "What do you do?" This basic and simple question carries a lot of deeper meaning and often conveys a myriad of assumed information, including economic status, social class, level of education, interests, abilities, political views, and personality traits. Through my research and personal interviews, I found that work is far more than the means to an economic end. Individuals in modern society are defined in large part by the work that they perform. Status shield refers to the prestige of a job, and affects how the public treats the worker in that position. Customer service jobs are often seen as low status, and because of that, workers are treated differently than people that work in jobs that seem more valuable to society. Catherine says, I don't believe that money should define a person, and therefore my lack of it should not be an impetus to be treated any different than the people that I am serving. However, in the service industry, there are assumptions that customer service representatives come from a lower socioeconomic class. This assumption is not only untrue in such an economy as today, but is harmful to workers that experience this interaction firsthand. Another of my respondents, Tasha, says, there's a difference between providing good customer service and letting people step all over you and treat you bad just because they think it is your job to take it. In service acting, the worker deceives the customer about what they really feel, but they are aware of their managed feelings. Their smile is not of them, but it is on them. And in that way, the worker may feel disconnected from expressions of feelings and actual feeling. Whereas in deep acting, display is a natural result of working on feeling. The actor does not try to seem happy or sad, but rather expresses spontaneously. Angela says, when you're at a job, you are supposed to leave your personal feelings at the door and have a positive attitude at work. I have pretended and put on a happy face on a number of occasions when I actually felt angry, depressed, or just overtired because customers want to see a smiling, helpful face. So what Angela expresses here is surface acting. She shows a positive attitude at work by putting on a happy face and managing her emotions to appear in high spirits. However, she is aware of her performance. Another respondent says, when I'm having a bad day, I know I have to maintain a certain impression, for lack of a better word. Sometimes, though, I think of it as a challenge. In my worst days, I try to go into work and be as positive as I can. And sometimes when I get off work, I find my attitude has actually changed, and what was once a horrible day isn't quite so bad anymore. So what is described here is deep acting. In this case, by pretending deeply, she alters herself and her emotions from negative to positive in a genuine way. For the majority of women I interviewed, being able to deep act and handle personal emotions is a skill that is learned over time. Often we forget about the substantial amount of emotional labor that goes into customer service jobs, as women in these jobs are professionals in managing their emotions. When dealing with constant customer interaction, employees only have a few seconds or minutes to give a positive performance for each customer. When there's a constant stream of customers, it is much harder to be heartfelt with every customer. But also, customers often don't realize how much effect they have over a worker's emotions. Tasha describes how customers don't always treat her with respect. She says, I usually take it in, and I don't say anything when I'm being treated different than what I would like. There's the fear of losing my job or getting less hours. Tasha's fear is very real for many workers. Learning how to respond to difficult situations in not just work-appropriate ways, but gender-appropriate ways as well, is part of that job description. Like I said before, work has deep and personal meaning. When we explore topics like emotional labor and women in customer service jobs, it's not just based in academia, but in real and honest experiences. So, how do we interact with workers in customer service positions? Do we interact with female employees differently based on the type of workplace? Do we make assumptions about their educational level, their socioeconomic class, their abilities and skills because of the work that they are doing? Do those assumptions affect how we interact with them? And as customers, are we aware of how our actions can make or break someone's day, the way that they view their job and themselves? These are my selected references. And I would like to thank all my respondents, my professors in the sociology and anthropology department, my coworkers and supervisors, my amazing friends and partner, and my thesis support group, as well as my Rocky family at the hardware store that really inspired and also supported my thesis. Thank you. Are there any questions?
What was the most surprising thing you learned in your research?
The most surprising thing I learned, I think, was how many people experience this masking of emotions. I feel like when talking to different respondents of ours, just having casual conversations with lots of different people, like at the very beginning when I asked you all, who has experienced what Maria was talking about with the masking of emotions, and the majority of you raised your hands. So the fact that we've all experienced that masking of emotions in customer service positions, I think, was one of the most surprising things. Yes?
What age range was your participants respondents?
The majority of my respondents were fairly young because I was using snowball sampling. So I was asking people who I knew, and then they were asking people who they know. So it stayed in a pretty consistent age range, mostly in the 20s. But my oldest respondent was in her 50s.
Hi, Danielle. Do you, I'm just curious, as a supervisor and thinking about that so many crews on campus, there's a customer service element. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for supervisors based on what you learned in your research?
I wasn't really looking at management as much as customer-worker interactions. However, yeah, I mean, a really important element to, like what Maria was saying at the very beginning in her quote about emotional labor, she talked a lot about how it's most difficult when you don't have an outlet to expressing negative or any negative feelings or anything that's going on throughout your day. So having supervisors who are supportive, who allow that space for that outlet to talk about things, I think would be really important.
I'm curious, I'm not sure if you, I suspect you do know this. You indicated that most of your respondents are young, and you indicated in your presentation that most of them are seasonal service employees. I'm curious about whether the implication, especially the kind of deleterious longer-term implication of doing service work, is different for people for whom that work is temporary and knowingly temporary. I did service work, but I knew I wouldn't do it for the rest of my life. I knew it was short-term. And so Hochschild talks about how negative emotions are expressed down the class ladder and positive emotions are expressed up the class ladder. And some people have really different experiences of all kinds of interactions, but especially those kinds of customer interactions. How different is that for people for whom that work is, again, during college and only during college, or for people for whom they kind of realize that that's their longer term work? And did you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. That's why I put in my limitations section, because the majority of respondents I had were seasonal workers. And I definitely saw that as a limitation, because the ways that we see work as identity is totally different based on if that's what you do to make a living versus if it's just part-time and you know that you're going to be going on to other things. And a few of my respondents actually did comment on that, saying that because they were seasonal workers, they knew that they had better things in the future, so they didn't internalize things as much as workers who were more full-time.
Are you going to continue this research in other fields, like nursing and such? Or would you want to?
For the specific research, I wasn't looking at specific occupation. Like it wasn't like Hochschild, she looks at just flight attendants.
Right.
Whereas with my research, I was looking at a broader range of customer service positions. The majority ended up being fast food and retail. But I guess.
Can you clarify, were all of your women in male-dominated service jobs? And if not, how many were?
The majority of the women that I interviewed were from predominantly male-type service jobs, based on my own experience and how I found those respondents because of my own experience at a hardware store. However, it was about half and half actually, because the majority of them had also worked in female-type service jobs as well.
And then how do you think men working in predominantly female-type service jobs might experience gendered organizations?
Men working in female-type service jobs, I think there would definitely be maybe a pressure to not be in that type of work or to take on more leadership positions or work up to a management role. There might be, but I wasn't looking specifically at men in my research, but I could definitely see a push for men to be going up the ladder in positions in those roles.
Thank you. Okay, our next presentation is from Erin Young, and the title of her presentation is Farming and Femininity, the Construction of Female Farmers' Identity in a Male-Centered Profession.
Thank you all so much for coming. As Christy said, the title of my thesis is Farming and Femininity, Identity Construction in a Historically Male-Based Profession. I'd like to begin with an explanation of why I chose to do my research on the topic of female farmers. I have been a member of the Warren Wilson College farm crew for 2 years. As I have worked on the farm, my understanding of work has grown, as well as my understanding of my own femininity. My passion for both farming and femininity inspired me to further understand how other female farmers construct their identities in the shifting agricultural world. Throughout the agricultural history of the United States, women have seldom been recognized for the contributions and work they have done in the world of farming. According to the Bureau of Agriculture's census, the number of women named principal operator of an American farm increased by 30% between 2002 and 2007. Women composed about 14% of principal farm operators in 2007, and that number has held steady since then, according to the preliminary 2012 census. As the number of female farmers rises and more they become a recognized group, there should be efforts to understand the identity of the female farmer within the historically male-centered world of agriculture. Through interview and observation of female farm owners and workers, I sought to understand how these women are constructing their individual identities as both female and farmer. To better understand identity construction and the influence of gender on an individual, I used the theories of symbolic interactionism, definition of situation, ecofeminism, social construction of gender dynamics, socialization, and agents of socialization. Symbolic interaction is the perspective that relies on the symbolic meaning people develop and rely on in the process of social interaction, as defined by George Herbert Mead. Through a symbolic interaction perspective, I looked at the ways female farmers were perceived in a work setting based specifically on subjective meanings imposed on objects, events, or behaviors associated with that farmer. For example, the feelings generated within the farmer when working a bull versus the feelings others experience while observing this. Socially constructed ideas about gender, as stated by Judith Lorber, are such a familiar part of daily life that it usually takes a deliberate disruption of our expectations of how women and men are supposed to act to pay attention to how it is produced. Gender signs and signals are so ubiquitous that we usually fail to note them. unless they are missing or ambiguous. Then we are uncomfortable until we have successfully placed the other person in a gender status. Otherwise, we feel socially dislocated. Looking at social constructions of gender, I saw how this affected the farmer's personal identity as well as ideas others had about her identity. For example, a female farmer feeling more hesitant than a male to do mechanical work on a farm vehicle, and this behavior being perceived as normal within the socially constructed ideas about gender. The theory of socialization explains that although cultural variability manifests in the actions, customs, and behaviors of whole social groups, the most fundamental expression of culture is found at the individual level. This expression can only occur after an individual has been socialized by their parents, their extended family, and extended social networks. I use this perspective to look at specific ways the farmer was introduced to agriculture and how this affected her understanding of her personal identity as both farmer and woman, as well as identity ideas she had about other female farmers. For example, a woman who is introduced to agriculture through working in the garden with her mother may more readily connect femininity and farming. As stated earlier, I used interview and observation to conduct my research. My research was entirely qualitative. My research methods were as follows. I selected my participants with the help of my bosses on the Warren Wilson farm crew who knew and were able to recommend many established female farmers in the area that I may be interested in contacting. I also contacted female farmers from my hometown and female members of the Warren Wilson College farm crew. All research participants must have been farming for at least 2 years, identify as female, and a farmer. I contacted 13 women and interviewed and observed 6 out of the 13, including the members of the Warren Wilson farm crew. The length of the interviews ranged from 1 to 3 hours and were conducted either on the woman's farm, the farm on which she was employed, in her home, or a coffee shop. The observation of my participants all occurred on the farms they owned or were employed on. The formal interviews conducted allowed me to hear specifically how my participants felt they constructed their identity as a female farmer, as well as understand how they felt their experiences as a farmer were related to their gender, if at all. The informal interview allowed me to speak more casually with them about farming, as well as hear their opinions and thoughts related to femininity or farming in a broader and less personal sense. It also allowed me space to hear any other information they felt was important. The observation allowed me to see interactions with others, as well as see things that applied to my research that the participant may not have articulated to me or that the participant did not recognize. As stated earlier, the number of female farm operators is on the rise, as shown by this census statistic. As the number of female farmers increases in both size and recognition, so too must research to understand the effects, experiences, and changes this group will have on the agricultural community, as well as changes that will occur within this group. In my personal research, I was limited by several factors. The pool of my participants was small. The ages of the participants ranged from 21 to 35, giving me only a narrow age group to hear from. Although this was a limitation, it also made it easier for me to understand and relate to the experiences my participants articulated. There was also a lack of racial diversity among my participants. 1 out of the 6 participants I interviewed identified as other than Caucasian, giving me a limited idea of the experience and identity construction of minority female farmers. This is also an indicator of the larger trend in the United States of fewer numbers of minority women owning farms. The amount of time I had to conduct and contact my participants was limited due to my own schedule as well as theirs. Access to travel was the largest limitation I faced in conducting my research. I contacted 13 female farmers and was able to interview and observe 6 out of the 13. This was due almost entirely to them being unable to leave their farms due to work-related events. This is also reflective of the unpredictable nature of farm work. Many of the participants I interviewed had most of their farming experience in the South, giving me data that was specific to that region and may reflect the culture and norms of the South. Several of the readings and authors that heavily influenced my research were Women in Farming, Property and Power by Sally Shortall, Putting the Barn Before the House, Women in Family Farming by Gray Osterud, Lise Seguare's article, The Cultural Representation of the Farming Landscape, Masculinity, Power, and Nature, Ruth Liepens, The Gendering of Farming and Agricultural Politics, A Matter of Discourse and Power, and When Women Drive Like Men by Barrett Brandt. Although all of these pieces touch on varying topics in the discourse on gender and agriculture, they all emphasize the important connection between a woman's gender and her navigation through the agricultural world. In Women in Farming, Property and Power, Sally Shortall focuses on illustrating the way agriculture has been shaped around the superior power of men based on male ownership of land. This quote from Becca, the co-owner of Balsam Mountain Gardens: "We realized the year before that if we didn't get bigger and start growing more food, we couldn't keep farming. So that introduced the issue of land access. This is really the biggest struggle for new and beginning farmers. You have no capital to start with, and people who are farmers who are successful inherited their land. We have leased some land nearby for the time being, and we've been looking for land for a long time. We think we've finally broken through." This quote illustrates my participants' experience with land access and ownership. Although Becca explained that land access is still a huge issue, she also expressed that her and her partner had found a piece of land. Becca's experience with land access is indicative of a larger shift in the agricultural world of women who have access to the money and opportunity to purchase land. Although more and more women are able to acquire land, this remains a class issue. As more and more female farmers become the co- or sole owner of their farmland, they have greater control over the decisions made on the farm. Sally Shortall also discusses the historical lack of female access to agricultural education. Because women were either less likely to inherit land or have access to purchasing land, they were much less likely to consider farming as a career. The recent shift in land accessibility is changing this. In Barrett Brandt's article, When Women Drive Like Men, female tractor operators were interviewed and asked how they felt when driving a tractor. The women said that operating a tractor caused them to experience increased feelings of control and mastery regarding both farm and other work. This ability also gave them increased feelings of influence, autonomy, self-confidence, self-reliance, and pride in both mental and physical capability. My interviews with female members of the Warren Wilson farm crew illustrated very similar responses. Although all of these participants are experienced tractor operators, they were not referring just to skills they had learned while on a tractor. They explained that the overall work and skills accomplished and learned on the farm gave them feelings of comfort, rootedness, awareness, and strength, both at work and away from work. I will read the following quotes to illustrate how their work as farmers translated positively into all aspects of their lives. And the names of these participants have been omitted due to the fact that they're members of this community, and you probably know some of them. "Farming has made me feel that working hard has made me trust my body more. Previously, I experienced my body as more of a mask that I couldn't take off, and I felt that many people identified me just by my looks. I felt like, hey, I'm a person over here. I think that farming has made me feel more comfortable in my own skin. When I'm done working, I often don't want to change out of my work clothes. I think it's because I feel a sense of stability in these clothes. I think I trust myself and my abilities more. I think farming has brought me out of myself and taught me to be present and oriented, and I think that those are lessons that are applicable to every sphere of your life. I am also just more aware of networks and interconnectedness of everything. An aspect of farming that has always been present, especially in the era when family farms made up the majority of agricultural operations, is the balancing of raising children and working. For centuries, women who farmed either had individuals in their community watch and care for their children while they worked, or their children worked with and alongside them. As indicated by one of my participants who farms with her husband, after having a child, she largely stopped doing the physical work on the farm and began doing more of the management and business aspects of the work. She said, "I did have this notion that I would be able to work in the fields with my baby on my back, but that just isn't realistic. I had all these notions that having a kid wasn't going to change my role on the farm, but it completely changed my role on the farm. I went from being able to do almost all of the physical labor to doing only management work." This quote, similar to the issue of land access, illustrates a certain amount of privilege that came with this participant's farming experience. For my participant to feel that she couldn't continue the physical work after having a child indicates that she had the resources at her disposal to adjust her situation to be able to care for her child in an environment that she felt was appropriate. Although I was not able to find much information on this issue that my participant raised, I do know that family farms are growing in number and currently produce 70% of the world's food, as shown by this quote. As the recognition of female farmers grows, this will surely be a topic that is further researched. I am interested to see how, as female farmers become more prominent in the agricultural world, these women handle both raising children and farm work. In doing my research, I was surprised by many of the answers I was given and the things that I observed. The main and most important findings from my research are as follows. My participants understand their gender as totally enveloped within their identity as a farmer. In work settings and situations, they do not think of themselves as only a female or a farmer, but both. All of my participants were introduced to farming through a close female family member or worked with a female farmer they admired and respected early on in their agricultural career. Through theories of socialization, one can see the connection between a woman who chose to become a farmer being affected by her introduction to farming through another female. Although I didn't find other research other than mine to support this, it does seem that women who were introduced to farming from another woman may more closely associate femininity and farming. All of my participants were initially hesitant to relate work-related situations and specific experiences on the farm to their gender. Rather than looking at these experiences as related to their gender, they attributed events and outcomes on the farm to personal and individual characteristics. After asking them specifically about how gender may have influenced a situation, they were often able to think of several instances where something happened to them as a direct result of their gender. The internalization of socially constructed ideas about gender can be attributed to these findings. Through symbolic interactions with machinery, animals, tools, and other workers, my participants closely associate the work they do on the farm with an identity of a confident, respected, strong, aware, and mentally and physically capable woman. The research I have done reveals only the tip of the iceberg that is the female farmer. As the number of female farmers rises, so should the research done on them. As my research participants indicated, they construct their identities largely based on the experiences and skills they learn while farming. The identity they construct through their experiences on the farm translates to their life both on and off the farm. These women learn through their work as farmers confidence, strength, awareness, respect, comfort, rootedness, self-reliance, and pride in both mental and physical capability. As the group of female farmers grows and changes, so too his socially constructed ideas about femininity. Although women have had very little recognition in their erecting of agricultural history, they will be and are becoming a part of its branching into greater inclusivity. These are some selected references that I used in writing my thesis and conducting my research. And these are all the wonderful people who helped me get through writing my thesis. Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Yeah.
So actually you found a lot of things that that farming like make women feel positive about themselves, or did you find anything that made them feel like because it's a male-dominated place, it actually made them feel inadequate, like they couldn't do as much?
Well, there were definitely situations my participants talked about off their farm, and it was oftentimes in situations where they were interacting with customers or the public, where they definitely felt like their gender had a negative effect on the situation. One example of this would be a woman I spoke to who was taking, or she was going to get a hog picked up from the slaughtering house, and when she went in, the guy was like, "Oh, you don't look like a hog farmer to me." And then they were very into helping her carry things, even though she could. And it was just clearly a reflection of them perceiving her as socially constructed ideas of femininity would have it.
Were any of your participants women who worked on conventional or big farms?
No, and I think that would be really interesting. Part of what I looked at in my thesis was the fact that there's very few women who have positions in factory farms. But I think that's a really fascinating thing, and I would really like to hear from those women.
That's kind of my question too, but also, did you talk to anyone about kind of like the hiring process and both like when women own farms, like who they're more likely to hire to work for their farms or things like that?
I didn't talk specifically to the women about that, but I did look at advertisements for jobs on farms, and there's often a little disclaimer about how you need to be able to lift a certain amount. That's really the only thing I saw that was gender specific on those advertisements, but that could be seen as a hindrance, I guess, in the hiring process. Yeah.
Did you come across any like cultural differences in farming and women? As far as like, I'm from Pennsylvania, so I've interacted with a lot of Amish farmers, and the people I've interacted with were women. And so I was just wondering.
Well, like I said, a lot of my data was really regionally specific, and so I didn't really come across anything like that. But I'm not really sure if this is what you were asking, but I do think that there probably would be a difference if I was to speak with women maybe who are from the north as opposed to women in the south, just because I think the cultures are different. But I didn't really encounter that.
I'm curious to whether you saw any differences between the people, women that grew up in families, histories of ancestors being farmers, or versus just back to basics and parenting.
Well, so according to the most recent census data, I guess the majority of female farm owners are in their 50s. And most of those women are women who have inherited farms that have been in their families for a while, but they don't actually do any of the farm work really. Mostly they just kind of oversee the farm and it's in their name. So I guess that would be a difference. I didn't really, although all of my participants were introduced to farming mostly through their mothers, it was like they would go to a friend's farm and help out or something. So none of my participants came from families that had a farming history. But data does show that with recent interest in agriculture, there's definitely a huge rise in people getting into farming who don't come from a background.
Wonder if you think you'd see a difference in farmers who identify as transgendered and if there could be a specific correlation or difference in the sex of an individual farmer as opposed to their identified gender.
Mm-hmm.
So if a male farmer who identifies as female would be treated similarly because of their female identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting topic, and I would really have liked to have interviewed people who weren't all heterosexual and weren't all. Most of the women I talked to, their partner was male. But I think that's certainly a different and very valuable perspective.
Is there a particular kind of animal agriculture that tends to have more women in it?
I don't know. I guess based on my own experience, I would say that what I've seen is that a lot of, I think a lot of livestock farms, it seems like they're often managed by men more often. And a lot of vegetable farms, maybe not a lot, but I've certainly encountered several where they're run by women. But I don't know.
In my experience, when I've been in agriculture, certainly around goats and chickens, that I've seen certainly a lot more women involved in that, both in Europe more than and also in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to see information on that.
Social science literature shows that networking is really important and can influence people's jobs. Here at Warren Wilson, do you find that that influences who joins the farm crews?
You mean like who they're friends with, or? Yes, I'm sure that to some degree it does, but I also think there's lots of people who volunteer on the farm crew who I don't think have any prior connection to it. But I would say that if you know someone on the farm, probably your level of comfort is higher in volunteering or wanting to join.
Thanks for the presentation, Erin. You were mentioning the book about women saying that driving a tractor would make them feel in control. But part of me sort of wonders, like, whether you found in your interviews with informants whether those kinds of responses and feelings were informed by the work that they're doing being perceived as being masculine and associated with male work. Did that come up in some of your interviews?
It didn't really come up, but whenever I was transcribing all of my interviews and looking for themes, I think that heavily influenced it. I think the fact that it's something, that they felt powerful as a result of doing that also came with an association of driving a tractor as maybe more of a masculine action. So that didn't, like I said, that didn't come up, but I definitely think that kind of inadvertently you could see it in the interviews. Yeah.
I kind of have two questions. Okay. I guess my first one is, I feel like there's a lot of shift toward like urban farming, and I wonder if that would affect like gender roles, since it seems like a more, I don't know. Did you look into urban farming at all?
I read one interview with a woman who owned an urban farm, but I don't know, I didn't see any research about more gender inclusivity in urban farms.
And I guess my other question is, I guess among the people that you interviewed on the farm crew here, was there any sort of gender bias that they experienced from like higher up, like supervisors, or I guess on any farm that they experienced from people within the farm but were still like higher up?
Not on the Warren Wilson farm, but one of my participants who works on the Warren Wilson farm now had previously wolfed on a farm, and the person that she worked for, there is a lot of kind of strange gender discrimination that went on in that. And it wasn't necessarily applying to her specifically in the work setting, but more the relationship outside of work. Okay.
Okay,
last presentation for this panel is from Carolyn Jubel, Bringing Home the Bacon, Transgender Men's Experiences in the Workplace.
Hi. I'm so excited to talk to you guys today because I've been working on this project since August, so it's really awesome to finally be able to share it with people. For my capstone, I chose to survey transgender men's experiences in the workplace. By transgender men, I'm referring to people who are born into female bodies, but who identify and live their lives as male. I'll be using the term trans man as an umbrella term for people with trans masculine identities, but as you'll see under each quote, my respondents use a variety of different terms for their gender identity. You may also hear me use the word cisgender, which refers to people whose biological sex aligns with their gender identity. So, why trans men? Transgender Americans are more educated than the general population on average. 47% have undergraduate degrees or higher, compared to 27% of the general population. And yet, unemployment rates for trans Americans are twice as high. 14% are unemployed, compared to 7% of all Americans. So this strongly suggests that trans people in the United States are being discriminated against in both the hiring process and within the workplace. Because discrimination is fueled by misunderstanding and stigma, academic research has the potential to shift cultural perception of trans people in order to reduce discrimination. And I just focus on the workplace because there are a lot of really interesting gender norms that are often exaggerated at work. Specifically in American culture, there's a lot of emphasis on men being in control at work and making the money. Hence the title, Bringing Home the Bacon. And this brings me to my thesis statement. Through survey data collection and a theoretical framework encompassing history, theory, and statistical data about trans men, I portray both individual lived experiences and macro-level social patterns affecting respondents. This research brings the experiences of my respondents into the light in order to demarginalize trans men and improve their experiences, particularly in their places of work. To let that sink in a little bit, what I mean is that I'm sharing my research today with you in order to dismantle some stereotypes about trans men, in the hopes that greater understanding will lead to better workplace experiences and overall quality of life. And while designing this research, I came up with some questions in order to identify the variables that reduce or increase workplace satisfaction. Do trans men with emotionally supportive communities have higher workplace satisfaction? Is conforming to standards of hegemonic masculinity at work important for trans men? Are trans men who perceive themselves as masculine typically more satisfied with their work? And do trans men living in states with legislation protecting gender identity from discrimination have better workplace experiences? And these questions became a guide for me, both in creating an instrument, which was a survey, and while analyzing data. Before I get into data analysis, I want to provide a basic overview of the theoretical framework that I developed from existing literature to approach this research. And there are several main principles to this research. The first is that cultural norms connected to gender are socially constructed. What I mean by this is that we learn gender throughout the course of our lives, and most of what we learn is not inherent to us biologically. For example, it's not inherently natural for men to make more money than women, or for women to prefer skirts and long hair to pants and short hair. These are things that we learn over time through both individual observations of the world around us and interactions with media, our parents, our teachers, everything. Hegemonic masculinity is limiting and harmful for male-identified people and everyone else. And what I mean by hegemonic masculinity is the culturally idealized behaviors, interests, and physical presentations that men are expected to embody throughout their lives. These expectations include a wide range of things, from musculature to paychecks to heterosexuality to refusing to cry, and so forth. I argue that hegemonic masculinity is harmful because it creates a hierarchy between men and women that subordinates all things deemed feminine. And this is harmful for male-identified people also, because it creates a social pressure to live up to these expectations and devalues all men who don't want to conform. Transgender people are an incredibly diverse demographic who do not have one singular experience. And this perspective is really important to my research because trans people are incorrectly presented as having similar or identical transition processes and life experiences in general. This screenshot is from Dude magazine, an Australian zine put out to dismantle stigma about trans men. It says, "Trans guys are not all the same. We are very diverse and don't all share the same personal identities. Be clear on the fact that sexual identity is totally different to gender identity. Some trans guys are femme, feminine, masculine, butch, faggy, queer, bisexual, and straight. And some of us might be all of these things at once. So I respect the diverse array of experiences that each of my respondents has by avoiding making certain assumptions. For example, I intentionally did not ask about whether or not my respondents have had or ever plan to receive surgery to physically transition, because it's my understanding that many trans men don't have the money or desire for such surgeries. Also, I really want to acknowledge the wide range of masculinity that trans men experience. Some trans guys look at their gender history as swapping to otherwise essential gender categories, while some trans guys see this as a much more fluid process, and they don't prefer binary terms. And as you can see, there are a lot of variations. Destabilizing normalcy and popular conception of gender is beneficial for society as a whole. Basically, what I mean here is just that society would be better off if people weren't funneled into such constricting gender categories, and if there was less pressure to be any particular type of person based solely on biological sex. And with all that said, I can move into some of the details of my research. Before I even started collecting data, I created a Tumblr blog and reached out to trans male-specific Facebook groups. I also attended a national queer conference in January to do some networking. And this is a screenshot of my first ever blog post. I used this page to ask trans guys questions, post excerpts and receive feedback, distribute my survey, and more. And in this post, I just described a general idea of who I am and what I was trying to do at that point. From this first post alone, I gained 50 or so followers. So this was a really useful tool for me. And besides social media snowball sampling, I also gained participants through personal contacts. And once I had a 100-question survey, I left it open for about 3 months and received 72 complete responses. I received responses from 27 states and Washington, D.C. This map reflects that geographic diversity. And within the 72 respondents, there are a diversity of racial and ethnic identities, but the majority, 66.7%, identify themselves as white or Caucasian. Additionally, most of my participants have high levels of education. You can see the specifics in the pie chart, but basically 40.4% have undergraduate degrees or higher. This statistic is pretty close to the national statistic about trans Americans' education levels. That number is 47%. A little under 60% work as employees, and the rest is either supervisors or managers, or do self-directed or self-employed work. The fields of work also varied. I had respondents in administrative work, manufacturing jobs, academia, the food industry, logging, construction work, the list goes on. The largest portion, though 42.3%, work in the service industry. And this may be because my respondents are relatively young. 62.5% of respondents are between 18 and 25 years of age, and only 12.6% are over the age of 40. My oldest respondent is 61 years old. So with all of these graphs, you can see that there is a bias to educated white trans men. This is mostly because I use social media to gather almost all of my participants. However, this same method allowed me to gain a wide geographic diversity, which was important because I'm looking at the state legislation policies, which I'll describe later. So now that I've given you a pretty good idea of who my respondents are, I can get into some of my major findings. There is very little existing research about trans men in the workplace. In fact, I could only find one book, shown above, that specifically does original sociological research asking trans men about their work experiences. This book is by Kristen Schultz. She's a sociology professor at the University of Chicago. And I used her work to determine the variables that needed further research and to determine variables that were left out. And listed here are the 5 variables that I measure in my survey. Like I said, the survey is 100 questions long, so with 72 respondents, that yielded a lot of data. 7,200 data points to be exact. So to make analysis go smoother, I created a quantitative scoring system for the separate sections of the survey. In other words, I created a point system for each of these variables so that I could measure correlations between variables and get some general statistics. Workplace satisfaction is a key component of my data analysis because I measure every other variable against it. In order to accurately measure this variable, I developed a scoring system in which I personally rated responses to several different questions, both quantitative and qualitative. And as depicted in the pie graph above, the majority of my respondents scored in the highest tier of workplace satisfaction, 13 to 16 points. However, in qualitative responses, many participants expressed that although they are satisfied with their job, they base that satisfaction on the assumption that they will be discriminated against. Respondents stated a number of reasons for this trend, primarily that they have to accommodate barriers associated with their trans identity. This first quote cites costs associated with trans-related healthcare as a barrier. I enjoy my job for what it is. I work with amazing people, although I'm at a point in my life where I feel a bit stuck. I haven't quite figured out how to do what I want to be doing, make money, and be me. Surgery is one thing in the way of that. Saving money for medical costs, even working a living wage job, is difficult when insurance doesn't cover many trans-related expenses. And the second quote cites fear of discrimination if you were to pursue other fields. It's okay, I'm kind of burnt out in my field, but it is also one of the more safe fields for trans, gender nonconforming, and queer people to be out. So many participants reiterated these sentiments, and many simply stated that even when their jobs work out and are fun and exciting, coworkers never fully understand what they are going through and can often be insensitive. So while participants scored highly in terms of workplace satisfaction, qualitative responses revealed that this self-reported satisfaction is often taking widespread stigma about trans people or other additional barriers into account. My next variable is respondent support systems outside of work. I created a scoring system similar to the workplace satisfaction scores that combines self-reported ratings of friends, family, and partner support and involvement with trans organizations. As you can see, I only found a moderate correlation between overall support systems and work satisfaction scores, which implies that having a better support system only has a slightly positive impact on workplace satisfaction for my respondents. Because this was not a very strong correlation, I tested the separate variables of this score, family, friends, and partner support, against work satisfaction separately. And I found a very significant difference in workplace satisfaction scores for respondents who have a partner versus those who do not. So for my participants, having a supportive partner has a positive impact on workplace satisfaction. These photos are of trans men and their partners from Dude magazine. The quote below is from one of my respondents. Of all the people I know, my partner gets it the most. She's unflaggingly supportive, not just of me, but of trans people in general, and the idea that our genders are as real and valid as the genders of cis people. Having a supportive partner can alter every aspect of the transition process for the better. You have someone to talk to after a stressful day at work, someone to help with health-related issues, and for some trans guys, having a supportive partner could mean affirmation for a changing body. In addition to relationships outside of work, I looked into how relationships inside the workplace impact workplace satisfaction. As the bar graph above shows, there are significantly higher work satisfaction scores for participants who reported having supportive work coworkers. In qualitative responses, many participants placed a particular emphasis on having a supportive boss as being very beneficial in the workplace. I work at a small bank. There are only 8 or 9 of us total. The managers were on board with me transitioning on the job and did a great job of stepping up and leading when it came time to switching to my chosen name. And they ordered me a new name badge, even though legally I haven't changed my name yet. My coworkers struggle at times with the name pronoun thing, but overall they are trying. I haven't had a negative reaction from any of them. So having supportive leadership at a job can set a precedent for other employees to be supportive. Trans-positive workplace policies could be put into place that would improve experiences, but this requires supportive leadership. And this leads me to my next point, which is about the legal atmosphere in the US surrounding trans issues. The current legal situation for transgender American workers is incredibly confusing because there is no federal policy. Every state has a different law that lists the various groups protected from workplace discrimination, and even the states that do include gender identity have varied policies. This map, created by the Movement Advancement Project, shows which states have legislation protecting trans Americans from workplace discrimination. It's only 17 states and Washington, D.C. Those light green states have laws protecting sexual orientation, but not gender identity. So that leaves 63% of transgender Americans unprotected from workplace discrimination, meaning that they can get fired at any moment for no other reason but for being trans. And of my respondents, only 31.3 reported living in states that do have a law. And of that 31%, an additional 35% reported that this law is ineffective. Here's a quote that explains how sometimes the laws are not enforced. Some ass is always going to find a way around the law to fire you or make you quit. A popular method I saw at my previous employer that I disagree with was overloading a person to the point of enormous stress, making them quit, or to the point of overloading them to show they weren't reaching quotas or goals, thus requiring termination. So this implies that the fight for ending discrimination against trans Americans in the workplace is much more complicated than simply making sure that laws are put in place nationwide. And to fight against workplace discrimination, trans workers typically have 3 options. To resort to state and local judicial arguments that require them to refer to their gender identity as a disability. To attempt to navigate the sticky legal battle of challenging the Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which protects people from biological sex discrimination. Or to work towards passing a Gender Identity Inclusive Employment Non-Discrimination Act, also known as INDA. All of these options are expensive or require a level of determination and empowerment that many trans people may not have access to at this point. And this image was created by the National Center for Transgender Equality, advocating for a trans-inclusive INDA to pass. This act was passed in the Senate in November 2013, but has been stagnant in the House ever since. If the House could vote on and pass this bill, then it could be signed into law, which would put an end to the confusing legal situation for trans workers. Feel free to call your congressperson right after this presentation. To measure masculinity, I adapted questions from an existing instrument called the Perceived Masculinity Scale. The photo above is a screenshot from my actual survey. I created a scoring system based on responses to 20 questions like these, in which higher scores signify that a respondent feels as if they are perceived as masculine in the workplace. I did not find a significant correlation between perceived masculinity scores and workplace satisfaction scores. So statistically, this means that being perceived as masculine may not be that big of a deal in the workplace for many of my respondents. Although interestingly, I did find a surprising amount of qualitative data that points to the importance of passing as male for many of my respondents. The friends who are aware are ones who knew me before I socially or physically transitioned. I pass completely now and prefer for people not to know unless I desire to be intimate with them. The other exception to this would be a close platonic friendship with someone whose life and personal history I know well. I do not want special attention for being trans, nor do I want to be the Trancyclopedia of Britannica. I just want to live my life as the person I should have been all along. So while being perceived as masculine does not seem to make a difference for my respondents, being perceived as male does have an effect. This is incredibly interesting to my research because it implies that expectations of hegemonic masculinity might not be the greatest barrier to fitting in and finding fulfillment at work, and that conforming to masculine standards may not be very important to a lot of trans men. Instead, this shows that simply being accepted as male could greatly improve overall quality of life, including workplace experiences. Although not explicitly measured in the survey, many respondents explained a tension between feminine and masculine roles. Because trans guys transition from a systematically devalued gender, female, into a more valued one, many of my respondents experience an awkwardness in navigating those roles. In the area that I work in, it is mostly male predominant, and after coming out and identifying as male, I've seen a change in how people treat me. When I was reffing as a female, male players would always question my calls and think that I was incompetent to ref because of my gender. When I started working as male, the players didn't question me as much and respected me a lot more. Another quote. The only discomfort I experience at work is when the men on the crew make racist, homophobic, or sexist comments. I'm still trying to figure out how to be assertive in these situations because I now have male privilege, but it is hard to break the habit of keeping my head down. So in these quotes, it is clear that my respondents are trying to find a balance between seeking comfort as men and respecting their own experiences before coming out. These respondents illustrate a clear awareness of the reality that they may be treated differently as men. And this acknowledgement of male privilege may be more difficult to come across in cisgender men because they do not have the life experiences that lead to this unique perspective. So that was an overview of my main findings. I go into much further depth in my thesis and explore several more variables, including race, age, and type of work. To close this presentation, I'd like to present my suggestions for improving the workplace experiences of trans men and summarize the significance of this research. As I explained earlier, federal legislation should be enacted in order to protect trans guys from discrimination, and so that trans-positive workplace policies can develop naturally over time. Additionally, this research calls for more research and activism around shifting policy to improve workplace experiences for trans men. Many of the themes that I've presented could be looked into further in order to identify specific policies that could create a more trans-positive work culture. Gender norms are so persistent in American culture that they are unavoidable social realities we must face. Transgender people may or may not personally seek to threaten the gender binary, but the act of transgressing biological sex causes a rift in the way that normalcy is constructed. History can be slow-moving, but it is pertinent to make room in society for all gender identities, and the workplace could be one site that promotes absorbing trans identities into popular culture. By dismantling stigma associated with trans and gender nonconforming people, we reduce the stress associated with tying specific roles to biological sex. So trans-positive activism and research will not only benefit transgender people, but all people who feel stress associated with expectations and limitations associated with their gender. So thank you for your time and for coming out to support us today. This is some of my selected references, and there are many more cited in my thesis. I'd like to thank all of my participants, and of course the Sociology and Anthropology Department for supporting me throughout my 4 years here, especially this last one. I'd also like to thank my friends and family, the service program, and anyone who showed interest in this project. Does anybody have any questions?
You just state again what other variables you looked at?
I also looked into race, type of work, like the different fields, and age.
Did you briefly talk about anything about those?
Yes, I did find a difference in, for respondents of color, there were lower workplace satisfaction scores. And I would love to do more research into that, but I don't think my instrument was strong enough to really measure those differences. So, but I would love to go into that later.
So 2 quick questions. You noted that the Movement Advancement Project finds high rates of unemployment among trans-identified people. Did you just eliminate unemployed people from your sample? Did you kind of have a preliminary question? Is that whether
yes.
So employed?
Mm-hmm. And in the informed consent, I stated that my population was currently or recently employed.
Okay, I just want to make sure because otherwise your data are very different than theirs, but it sounds like that's not the case. And then secondly, it sounds like people are not aware that the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, the EEOC, actually has found that gender identity is a protected status.
Yes,
I write people are just unaware of that.
Yeah, I write about that in my research, and it really does seem like a lot of people are unaware of that, and I think that promoting that would be a good way to start.
Sort of bouncing off that, do you know of, in the states that you listed that actually have protection for trans people, are there any lawsuits that have been successful that set a precedent that it's possible to tackle workplace discrimination?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I'm sure that there are lawsuits that have been filed. I'm not sure about the success rate of those. Yeah.
I'm curious, I'd love to hear you talk about your experience of someone who does not identify as trans male or transgender, what it was like for you doing the research, particularly like you talked about going to the conference in January and meeting some folks in person, how you were received by some of the participants in your study and how you kind of navigated that.
Well, as a volunteer at that conference, it's the Creating Change conference run by the National Center for the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, sorry. But I volunteered at that. So as a volunteer, I had access to several spaces that I wouldn't have otherwise. I worked in the transgender hospitality suite, just making sure that there was water and coffee for everyone. So I was able to meet a lot of people and to tell a lot of people about my survey because it was open at that point. And I think that I was received pretty well. I mean, sometimes it's a little awkward to be like, hi, do you want some coffee? Also, I'm doing this research. But it worked out fine.
Do you hope to continue this in the future, and what direction would you like to move in?
Yeah, I discovered that I really like doing research through this process, and I would love to keep doing this later on in life, either through grad school or working with an organization.
I'm curious about how you brought up that some of these participants identified this sort of interesting conundrum of switching to a role that was privileged. Mm-hmm. And did any of them express that they had, I know one of your folks sort of expressed that they
felt the need to keep their head down and still. Did anybody feel the need or try to tackle any of those issues or express you sort of tackling them in their unique perspective?
Because it was a quantitative instrument mostly, and all like there were lots of quantitative sections for people to fill in. I didn't specifically ask about that. That was one of my variables that sort of came up after reading through and coding. But I think that it would be really interesting to interview trans guys about that experience of transitioning from female to male, what it's like to experience the benefits or disadvantages of a different gender.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.